I'm Nate Persily. I'm the co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, along with Jeff Hancock. And we are thrilled today to do what we here at academic institutions are most proud of, which is to celebrate the production of scholarship. Rarely, though, is the production this substantial, I should say, both here and in general. And so we are thrilled that we can take this opportunity to celebrate this book, Regulating Under Uncertainty, Governance Options for Generative AI by Florence G'sell, along with many other people in this audience who helped put this together, because this was a team effort, actually, for scholars around the world to try to canvass the available proposals related to regulation of generative AI, and to really put in one place all of these different proposals that people are talking about. I will say that this has been a particularly challenging book to put together, because one of the problems for anybody who's writing in the area of artificial intelligence right now is that you never know when you're done, right? And so despite the fact that this book is over 460 pages long, at every stage there was a question as to whether it was time to move it out the door. In some ways, ideally, we would have a living document that would continually be updated, every week, because every week there are new proposals, new legislative action, new laws that are being passed. I will say that Professor Florence G'sell, who runs our program on governance of emerging technologies, was uniquely well situated to write this because of her vast experience in looking at European regulation. And so since the Europeans were the first movers on so many of the regulatory questions, having someone who's an expert on European law has been absolutely critical. However, the tome tries to wrestle with proposals from around the world. Jeff and I actually went and did a kind of field visit to Korea and Japan last year, and I went on to Singapore to look at the way other countries are looking at these questions, because we are heavily focused here in the Cyber Center because of where the regulation has been happening, looking at Europe. But of course, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and so we need to pay attention to all the countries and all the proposals that are out there, which is why even in 400 plus pages, it's extremely difficult to wrap one's arms around this. And so we're going to start with Florence G'sell presenting this book, and then we will have Jake Ward, who's known to many of you from television, from NBC and otherwise, who will moderate a discussion on the book and about regulation of generative AI. And then we'll open it up for questions. But I just want to say to Florence, congratulations. Thank you for putting this together. I'm glad you made it over the finish line with this enormous book, and we really value your contribution today. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I'm, of course, honored and delighted to be presenting this work today. And yes, it was a teamwork, and I'm so happy to see familiar faces in the room. And I also know that there are people watching us from various regions of the world, from Japan, from South Korea, from Brazil, and even from France. It's the night in France, but I know that we have people that are currently watching us. And so, yes, so this report, the title of this report is Regulating Under Uncertainty, but it was also writing a report under uncertainty, and even finalizing a report under uncertainty, because when we started working on this, the US executive order was not adopted. The EU AI Act was being negotiated and was very different from what it is today. So we had to update again and again. And we finally released the report a few weeks ago and then decided to update it one more time. So what we're releasing today online is an updated version as of September 2024, because we wanted to take into consideration the very interesting and stimulating Californian debate that took place over the summer. And so I think that Senator Wiener is currently here, or he will be here in a minute. So hopefully this will be the occasion of a very stimulating discussion about this. So yes, uncertainty. It's always the case with technology. It's always the case when you face an innovation, it's uncertain. The future is uncertain, the benefits are uncertain, the risks are uncertain. And the question is, what do you do when there is some uncertainty? And is there something different with AI than with previous technological evolution? An example that I often give is what happened in France in the 19th century. It was the very beginning of the industrial revolution in France. France was becoming equipped with railways, and there was an Academy of Medicine in Lyon in France that released a report saying speed is very dangerous for health. So people are going to have breathing issues. Pregnant women are going to suffer from miscarriage. And so there should be a regulation to prevent people from taking those dangerous trains. And of course, nothing happened at the time, and those risks never materialized. So you can exaggerate the risk, of course. You can fail to see the risk. And so this is something that we witnessed with, for example, drugs. In the drug market, you can have new molecules that are being created and that finally are dangerous. So it's a very difficult question. And so for regulators, for policymakers, it's a complicated dilemma. You have various options. So this is what we try to do in this research. Try to figure out what is possible. So we try to list the various options. Of course, self-regulation, which is the first move, the first option that you can take. The other option is, hello, Senator, very honored to have you tonight. So the other option is government regulation. And finally, something that is probably common to every country in the world, it's a form of dialogue with the industry, between regulators and the industries, that you could call to some extent co-regulation. So of course, self-regulation, the first option, has advantages. Probably the main advantage that I see here in choosing self-regulation is that currently the expertise is with the private sector, is with the industry. So you could just say, well, this is the people that really know the technology, that know the pace of evolution of the technology, and so they know how to establish the proper standard. They know how to be responsible, so they are in the right place to do this. Of course, they are for-profit organizations, and of course, they operate in a competitive market. So they want to release models, they want to release very advanced models, and they are not that concerned by the risks. So another possibility, and this is, I'm a French lawyer, as you can hear, and of course, this is something I'm accustomed to, which is government regulation. Saying, well, we shouldn't wait, we should regulate, we should set up the standards, we work for the public good as regulators, and of course, we know how to protect the general public. So this is, of course, an advantage. The problem is that it's very difficult to draft a proper regulation under uncertainty, especially if you get information from the regulated companies. If there is a strong asymmetry of information, if the expertise is with the industries and the information you get comes from the private sector. And so there is always a risk of regulatory capture because there is this very strong asymmetry. So you need the resources to draft the regulation and to implement it, which is not easy. And of course, if your regulation is not properly written, properly drafted, you might create legal uncertainty, and it might be very complicated for the private sector to innovate and to grow. So you might stifle innovation. So the third option might be the right one, but it's a question. And this is what we are witnessing around the world. The fact that there is this dialogue that is taking place between regulators and the private sector to share experience, to share information. So this is what the EU is currently doing with the drafting of the codes of conduct within the context of the implementation of the AI Act, doing this with the various stakeholders in order to have the proper information and to have everyone around the table. And this is what NIST is currently doing here in the US, working with the industry, involving NGOs in the process. And so, of course, there is still a risk of regulatory capture, but maybe perhaps it's the most efficient way to draft adapted standards. The main disadvantage that I see is that it's very difficult when you choose this option to implement unforeseeable mechanism, to have something to make sure that the AI companies that commit to follow a certain standard effectively comply with the standard. So if you try to summarize what's currently going on, you could say that as of now, the US has mainly prioritized self-regulation or encouraged self-regulation, while the EU has recently regulated. So you have this pyramid that symbolizes the AI Act that many people are familiar with. We will have, of course, the occasion to expand on this during the conversation. What I would like to highlight here is that currently today you have various critical points, and I listed 5 of them. The first one is what I started with. What do you do when there is an uncertainty? Currently, the debate is about the fact that the regulatory attempts arrive or are adopted too quickly. We should wait. We should wait for a better information about the risk. We should wait for better evidence about the possible risk or the possible future. And so this is a very important question. Should regulators, should legislators wait, or should they act under uncertainty and take the risk to adopt a regulation that is not fully adapted? The regulation itself might create uncertainty. So here you have this campaign that was launched by Meta a few weeks ago that criticized European policies. It's mostly about the GDPR and the application of the GDPR to generative AI. Yes, why? Because the GDPR is not really adapted to this technical evolution. And so it exemplifies a problem with regulation when the technology evolves rapidly. Sometimes you draft a regulation, the technology evolves, and then your regulation is not adapted to this evolution. Of course, you have this question of innovation. And so I cited here the debate about California Bill SB 1047 that was accused of stifling innovation. Of course, this is something that is being said about the AI Act by various types of people, even very recently by Mario Draghi, a former European commissioner, in a report that said, well, this is not adapted to the economic growth that we would like to have in Europe. Another question, should we focus on technology? Should we focus on use cases when we regulate? It makes sense to focus on use cases and to say when you use AI in the healthcare sector, then it's sensitive. And so this is where you should have very strict rules. But it's not that easy when you have general purpose models because you don't know how they will be used. So you need something that is probably broader, a rule that is more general. But it's not easy because it implies that you have appropriate definitions and appropriate principles. And then there are pending questions about the most advanced so-called frontier models. Should you have specific rules for those very powerful models? But if so, how do you determine the most riskiest, the most powerful or the riskiest models? Is, for example, the criterion of the computational resources adapted to determine the riskiest models? So this is an important question. And there is also this debate about open source models. you could say on the one hand, well, we want to promote open source because open source is transparency, open source is democracy, open source is freedom. But at the same time, you have those risks. And could you really say that open source models are safer? It's not that easy. It's not that evident. So this is a question that needs to be raised. And as for me, I don't have any final answer to this, but this is probably a question that we can discuss. And so I will stop here with these various questions that that we can certainly discuss today. And Jake, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Florence, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm very grateful to the Cyber Policy Center for inviting me to be part of this today. It's such an esteemed group. We could get everybody up on stage. Our panelists could take their seats now. Senator Wiener, you and I are the same height, and so I don't know how you're going to sit in these chairs, but try. And I think I just want to start by sort of the opportunity that I have as a journalist. So I've covered technology for a long time, and I wrote a book that came out in 2022, about 9 months before ChatGPT did, called The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. It was panned at the time as highly speculative. Turns out I should have been a little more speculative, because my thesis was essentially that AI was going to produce an uncontrollable psychosis in the human species, and especially in the public markets, and that we would fall in love with it before we knew what we had. And here we are. Hey, that's funny. And so I wonder if there's a way, when I am speaking with my various sources in Silicon Valley, and I mention EU regulations, nothing makes people's eyes roll in Silicon Valley like talking about EU regulations, the GDPR and the AI Act. And so I wonder if maybe we could start. I feel like, Nate, before we get to our European experts, maybe you could sort of give us a little sense here of, and you've introduced yourself once, but maybe if each of you could introduce yourself as you begin speaking so that we can all get oriented. Just give us a little sense of the gulf that you see between what Florence has described as this emphasis on self-regulation and where the EU has gone. You have long experience in social media and thinking about that world in this context as well. Give us some sense of the sort of the history of self-regulation in technology.
So thank you. The path that we're seeing with respect to regulation of AI is a familiar one to anybody who's been looking at the regulation of technology generally, particularly in the age of the internet. And there is I think, a foundational question as to whether we are fighting the last war, or whether the mental map that we have developed with respect to social media is now being inappropriately grafted wholesale onto this new technology. Now, the story, if you're going around Europe, right, as Florence hinted at, there has always been this conceit that particularly the privacy regulations, GDPR, maybe have been seen as counterproductive and stifling of European innovation. I think that the jury is really out on that. I don't think that one can say that definitively. There are all kinds of reasons as to why we have innovation in Silicon Valley, and that may not have been as widely shared around the world. But certainly that has been the debate, is that in Europe, the sort of tendency toward regulation ends up being more innovation stifling. I will say, at the risk of teeing up the senator too early here, which is that you have seen innovation in the States, in the United States, not only with respect to AI, but also with respect to social media, whether it's regulations related to children, privacy, other kinds of regulations. Of course, that is, I think everyone would agree, a non-ideal situation in the United States. But in some respects, technology regulation is like other regulation, which is our federal government is completely dysfunctional right now. And so that this has been the least productive Congress in American history. And so it's not a surprise that it wouldn't have passed laws with respect to something like AI. And so then the burden falls on states, and falls in particular on California, since so much of the innovation happens here.
So, Florence, you have written this extremely impressive tome looking across the landscape of regulation. EU regulations are obviously the most ready at hand for analysis. Talk a little bit about this gulf between self-regulation and what the EU has pursued, and maybe you could give us some sense of, is there something in the historical or cultural character of the EU, something about the experience of the member nations that leads them down the path of regulation a little more quickly than we do here in the United States?
Yes, I'm not sure that there is a pattern about how the EU regulates. I would say that if we look at what the EU has been doing regarding digital technologies, we could just say that in the case of social media, for example, so regulations like the Digital Services Act came pretty late. And so this is something that many people say, well, it came too late. We had the e-commerce directive that was adopted very early in 2000, but then we waited for a long time before we to adopt a new regulation, the DSA. And many people said, well, the DSA it's just implementing what social media companies are already doing. And my impression is that in the case of AI, the idea was to say we don't want to let the industry set the standards. We want to really provide the main principles that we want to be respected because it's too important, the stakes are too high. And you find in this regulation, as in the DSA, this idea of systemic risk, which means that you can have risks that are of major importance that affects the whole society, which is the reason why there is really a need not to wait to take action. So this is my impression, but I wouldn't say that there is. And the second point that I could make is that we read the US executive order and the AI Act. At first, we had the idea to compare the two regulations, which is super hard to do. Why? Because when you look at the executive order, starts with very technical definitions. It's a very pragmatic and very technical text. While the AI Act is a text that is written by lawyers, by people like me, but they provide a few definitions about the technology, but not that many. And so now we are waiting for the implementation. And so a lot of precisions about how to effectively implement the AI Act. And so this is something of interest as well.
Yeah. Senator Wiener, thank you so much for being here. This is a very busy time. I don't know quite how you made time for this, but I really appreciate you being here. So as Florence mentioned, right, there's the Executive Act that comes out and offers this sort of soft guardrails around AI. You have all of the top luminaries in the industry speaking very openly about the possibility of an existential risk, but also trying to reassure us that they are thinking about it fairly deeply. That feels like a departure from past industry leaders. Why SB 1047? What was was there an aha moment? Did you have a meeting in which your eyes were open? What for you was the moment that led you to believe this was a necessary act?
Well, thank you for having me today. It was very organic. I have the honor of representing the beating heart of AI innovation, San Francisco. And I'm surrounded by incredibly smart technologists at startups, at large companies and academia, it's so on and so forth. And folks started sort of talking to me about, hey, you should take a look at some of the risks here, and we started having a series of meetings and salons and dinners with really smart people. And
can I just ask you, who gets to you at that moment before your mind is made up? Who is it that comes into the room? Is this industry? Is it academics?
It was a broad spectrum of people some people who were at large tech companies or used to be at large tech companies or were at startups or founded companies, it was like they didn't all agree on everything. There were a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of different opinions. And we ultimately just started working through ideas and then published in September of last year an outline, a detailed outline, which is in a very formal way, which we don't typically do, 5 5 months before we actually introduced the bill for the sole purpose of inducing feedback on the bill. And we didn't get that much, because sometimes until it's real, like people, don't want to focus on it. But ultimately, we've seen, and I agree, comparing AI to social media, obviously they're different things, although social media has a big AI component, which is one of the things that threatens to topple our democracy, right? You've seen that there is an algorithm that, determines what you see on social media. And so we have people who get sucked down rabbit holes, and, whether it's, the young men who are fed unending Andrew Tate sort of rape stuff on social media, or whether it's people who get fed into different QAnon conspiracy theories, or election deniers. That's all, version of AI through social media. So it's not completely separate, but these are also some unique issues. But the big picture is that we had this new technology that came on the scene, social media. We literally did nothing, nada about it. Nothing. We just let it go. It did what it did in 2016. It over and over again. We're seeing what it's done in terms of mental health of young people, feeding young women anorexia, stuff on TikTok, and so on and so forth. And although there's plenty of good, social media has done a lot of good in the world, so I'm not one to just demonize it. But there were downsides, because with any powerful technology, there are risks and there are downsides. And so the goal is not to squash the technology or harm it, but to say, hey, why don't we give some thought before the harm happens to what that harm might be, and let's think about whether, and maybe there isn't a way to reduce the risk, but whether there is a way to reduce the risk in a manner that doesn't impede innovation. And that's what 1047 was. And there was a lot of vibes on both sides of 1047. And I was really flattered that so many vibes around SB 1047. But SB 1047, and folks who were against it, I think there were times painted to be bigger than it really was. And there were people who were for it, who sometimes painted it bigger than it really was. But what it did was, I think it really advanced the conversation of saying, okay, should we be thinking ahead of time about what the risks are and thinking if there are ways to reduce the risk? And although the bill was not signed into law, the conversation is not, the horse is not going back in the barn. And so that's really, in my mind, where it came from and why it was a beneficial process.
And the governor, of course, Gavin Newsom, vetoed this bill in the end.
Yeah.
Does, under those circumstances, does the governor call you and say, here is my objection to the bill, here is why I am vetoing it?
Well, he wrote a very detailed, his veto message was far more lengthier and more detailed than most veto messages. Usually they're like a couple paragraphs, maybe a page. If I recall correctly, it's a few pages. And I do think, this bill got overwhelming support from Democrats in the legislature, and even some Republicans voted for it. It was actually not super controversial within the legislature. And I know that the governor really, thought long and hard about this. I just had that sense. And reading the veto message, it was clear he was getting heavily pushed by folks he, I think, knows and trusted, from what I can tell, on both sides. And he ultimately, decided for him it wasn't the right approach. But he was clear in his veto message, and I appreciated this. He stated very clearly the risks identified in the bill are real, and it is important for us to do something about it. I think he also mentioned the obvious, that Congress has in recent years done some very positive things around climate, infrastructure, and so forth. But around technology regulation, Congress has struggled in a huge way. And other than banning TikTok, Congress has not taken a big step on tech regulation in more than 25 years. So the governor recognized we should do something, and he even named who the three people are who are going to lead a process for him for next year, and I'll be involved. I've talked to them about being involved in that process. We're not going anywhere. I'm already meeting with folks who supported the bill, folks who opposed the bill, and I'm appreciative that the governor is engaging in that kind of constructive way.
So, Gerard De Graaf, you are the digital envoy. You spent 30 years inside the EU Commission. Give us your reaction to this. Right, we have clearly the governor of California coming down on the side of, if Florence has described this distinction between, do we get out in front of uncertain risks, or do we let the empirical evidence mount first and perhaps let a catastrophe happen in the meantime? The governor seems to feel, he says, I agree with the author. We cannot afford to, in the veto message that Senator Wiener mentions, we cannot afford to wait for a major catastrophe to occur before taking action to protect the public. But he says any framework for effectively regulating AI needs to keep pace with the technology itself. Give us your reaction to this bill and the veto.
Well, I represent the European Union, so it's not my role, I think, to comment on legislation that originates in the California legislature. We're following it very closely. We've had also the honor and the privilege to work with Senator Wiener and other senators and assembly members, and there have been quite a few bills passed. Not Senator Wiener's one, and so there has been very good activity, and I think it's also been important to have that kind of learning curve on AI. What I can say from the EU perspective is that, this is not something we've discovered like a year or two ago, and we've been working on regulation or policy for 5-6 years. We started in 2017, 2018 on AI. And yes, there is uncertainty. There always is with regulation. We've also learned a bit. I was very actively involved in the DSA and in the DMA, which is not what platforms are doing. If it is what they were doing, they wouldn't be struggling to comply, frankly, and there wouldn't be so many investigations going on against some of these practices. But I think what we've learned since, with the e-commerce directive 1998 adopted and changed for 2020, we've done nothing. Also in the European Union, we've done nothing. We've enabled the platforms by creating framework conditions that were very favorable for them to grow. And I think we have learned some lessons in the European Union. The social media has, and I think the Senator has given some really good examples here, has created major kind of societal harm. And so when we now look at AI, and of course we've also caught up, the last European Commission was a commission on climate and on digital, and we delivered. And we prepared this very carefully, like with kind of the AI. Yes, you are regulated uncertainty, but if you bring in a lot of expertise, you get a lot of kind of important views in that you can take into account. And it's not that AI kind of happened. You had foresight bringing out a book before ChatGPT 3 happened, but AI has been around for a very long time. And so it's not that kind of something new is hitting us. And in the European Union, we have a tradition, and I think there is something also profoundly democratic about these issues. Why should we entrust private sector CEOs? I sometimes say, who did elect Elon Musk and Sam Altman and Sundar Pichai to take these decisions about how the technology should be used in societies for us? This is where you elect senators like Senator Wiener. We are in the European Parliament, or in the European Union, we select members of the European Parliament. We have member states with ministers. Those are the places where these decisions, from a societal point of view, need to be taken. This is an essentially democratic issue. Fortunately, in the European Union, lawmakers still deserve the name to make laws. We haven't lost the art of compromise in the European Union, so we have also important also from the European Union perspective that we set out very clearly a framework. It's important for the industry. If you look at surveys about AI, and in this country, there's even more people who are distrustful of AI than in the European Union. I think 54% of Americans say, I'm not sure about AI. I'm apprehensive about it. I don't trust it. But if you are going to develop a technology and you want to grow a market, then more than half of your potential customers say, I'm not sure I want to have anything to do with that. That's not helpful. Trust is absolutely essential to a market. And where does trust come from? Not necessarily what companies say and promise, because they have their own incentives and interests, which are not necessarily aligned or not aligned with societal interest. The trust comes from a predictable regulatory framework. The investments that the industry have to make are enormous. I mean, tens of billions of dollars are being invested in it. Well, do you not want to have some kind of certainty that these are going to be the rules of the game, and the rules of the game are not going to be changed every now and then? So I think that's really kind of an important, like, pro-innovation dimension of regulation. And in the European Union, and you see it now in the States. I mean, we welcome in a way the kind of the activity of California, and as the biggest state, you have the California effect. But the risk, as we've seen, I mean, we talked about why Europe hasn't got these many big tech companies. Well, I can tell you one of the reasons is we have a fragmented market. If you grow in one country, like in Germany, and you want to expand to the rest of Europe, the first person you need to hire is a lawyer, because the rules are different. So your growth is more difficult, it's more costly, and it is slower. And in the internet, it's all about scale and speed. So in the European Union, and people don't believe me when I say it, the AI Act or the DSA or the DMA are deregulatory, because they remove laws from the books in the member states, in the 27 member states. As a business, you have one set of rules for the whole of Europe, and you can approach and you can kind of do business. 450 million users on the basis of one rule book. That's an advantage. And I think in the US, I mean, frankly, I mean, we don't wish this upon our enemies. I mean, if you go from a situation where you have one set of laws, federal, kind of the federal, but the Congress is like just dysfunctional. I'm using Nate's term here. States will fill that vacuum. California will lead, you'll have the California effect, but you will see fragmentation happening in this country. And that is bad for innovation. Regulation is not per se bad for innovation. On the contrary, I think many of the sectors in the US are under-regulated. Banking is much more innovative in the European Union. Transport is much more innovative. Health is much more innovative. The telecommunications sector is much more innovative. Regulation can be very positive for innovation. But what is absolutely stifling innovation is rules and regulations that are very different and are not kind of convergent. And that's, I think, the risk that this country is facing.
Thinking here about, you've almost all mentioned now, social media and sort of what lessons we've learned from social media. It reminds me of an anecdote. I sat about a year and a half ago with Eric Schmidt, former chairman of CEO of Google, who was coming to us and many media outlets as a sort of harbinger of an enlightened perspective on AI, both a booster of its potential, but also trying to speak, in his words, frankly, about its potential risks. And he said, basically, his spiel to me was, I was naive about social media. I was naive about the effects it would have on our democracy and our children and the rest of it. But this time you can trust us. He said that to me. This time we've got it, basically. And he sort of said it has to be left to the people with the technical expertise to regulate ourselves. Janel, this brings me to you. You are Deputy General Counsel of Anthropic. And Anthropic's brand intellectually around AI for a long time has been this very thoughtful, some would even argue doomorist sensibility about the potential of AI to do real harm. There's a big New York Times profile of your company that sort of was on that. But now we have your CEO, Dario Amodei, coming out with a 15,000-word manifesto saying, I'm actually much more utopian about this. At the same time, your company is raising a bunch of money right now. There's many factors at work here. Give us your perspective. I'm especially interested in what he had to say about, in his letter, the notion of an entente, in which he says, quote, a coalition of democracies seeks to gain a clear advantage, even just a temporary one, on powerful AI by securing its supply chain. A kind of coalition of the willing seems to be his regulatory idea. Tell us a little bit about Anthropic's perspective on that.
A little bit of background on my experience. I've been working in AI for almost 8 years now. I started off counseling AI R&D and emerging technology R&D at Google before I joined Anthropic in early February of 2023. So I've seen both sides of the spectrum in terms of different approaches to AI regulation and internal governance. I would say that Anthropic's perspective is truly unique and genuinely so. And it's very easy for one to become pretty cynical in tech in this space in this day and age. And I truly believe that Anthropic has a genuine approach to AI safety and the catastrophic risks that we talk about occurring. I think it's important, though, to think about risk as a broader spectrum. I mean, we talk very much, Anthropic's mission is probably more focused on kind of the catastrophic risk flavor of AI safety. But it's really important when, we talk about social media harms to think about the safety impacts related to what I call more societal impacts and more of the traditional tech harms that we've seen come about. And one thing that I find really interesting about the conversation or the analogy between AI, regulating AI now, the need to do so right away because we felt like we were behind on social media, is that social media harms actually felt like they took a while to appear over time. It wasn't, this technology comes on the scene, it's a way to connect with our friends and our colleagues. We see all the clear paths to potential misuse and significant widespread risks. A lot of the social media harms are a bit more insidious and a bit more harder to perceive right from the outset. Whereas I think with AI, it's a lot easier to see how this technology can exacerbate both societal, like kind of normative technological harms that we see coming from AI, social media, and the things we're really focused on today. And that is also fueled the desire to regulate very quickly on the catastrophic risk side, because we also see some urgency there. But I think that is where I see a bit of a dissonance in regulatory approaches, because some of the harms that we're trying to mitigate against through regulation are harms that actually take a longer time to emerge. And you don't want to over-regulate because maybe those harms actually don't emerge and you're being overly conservative or overly prescriptive and thus stifling innovation, and really focusing on the harms that are truly imminent. And those are the ones that Anthropic believes we can actually test for, assess, evaluate, benchmark, and try to take action against.
Senator Wiener, when we think about the catastrophic flavor of risk that Janel mentions here versus some of the more mundane short-term risks to everything from labor to creativity to the nature of education. I was just speaking the other day to a professor at Cal who, I'm sorry to say the word Cal on this campus, but that's just how it goes. So everybody, he teaches a class in deeply reading literature. They read 3 books very closely. And he says that it has become a nightmare to teach this class because the students now arrive and they consider there to be no difference between having read a summary of the book by ChatGPT and having read the book. They don't see the difference between having done those 2 things. He has to work quite a while to get them to see such a thing. What is, would you say, Senator, the political appetite for trying to regulate these more mundane harms versus the kind of long-term existential Terminator scenarios that even the makers of these technologies seem to want to talk about?
Depends what you mean by mundane. And first of all, I do just want to really acknowledge Anthropic for being willing to step out on SB 1047. There were different categories of how people approached the bill. There were some good faith opponents who had very specific issues. There were sort of bad faith opponents who would move the goalposts, and no matter what you did, there would be some new criticism. And then there was Anthropic, which and GitHub is in this category too, who came to us and said, "Hey, we see what you're trying to do. We have some very detailed feedback," and we ended up accepting most of Anthropic's ideas in either completely or modified form. And Anthropic then followed through and didn't formally take a position, but sent a positive letter to the governor saying the bill was on balance good, that it was implementable, that the risks were real, and that Congress was unlikely to act. And that was sort of a game changer on the bill because it really it showed that there could be industry support for these ideas. So I don't know, in terms of like the job impacts of AI, I personally would not refer to that as mundane. It might be more, I think it's more tangible. but it's and maybe more day to day. So maybe then it is mundane, but it's certainly not. It's huge. I think in some ways the job issue is the hardest one from a policy perspective, because that is truly like, do you support this technology or do you not support it? Do you want people to do this, or do you want artificial intelligence to do that? And that is like a sort of a clash of the titans. And you know, we all, there's a perspective which I hope is correct, and I think would be amazing if it worked, that AI will simply make everyone's life easier, and there'll be less work, we can lounge about, although query whether it's healthy for people just to lounge about too much. But you know, we know that in the reality of our world, benefits are not usually equally shared, and so you know, but to me, that's in some ways the hardest one. Then you have the what maybe are mundane, or at least more like tangible potential harms, deepfakes, revenge porn, which is the newest pernicious thing, making up fake porn with usually a young woman in it, and upending her life using AI, and algorithmic discrimination, and this is going to be actually a growing issue, that algorithms are going to make more and more decisions about our lives, whether it's flagging something on some app that you posted, or banning you from something, to making decisions about whether you get a loan or a housing or whatever, and with the possibility that there will be no human who will interact with that in any way, and that could actually be quite scary, or it could be really beneficial. So I think there is an appetite, and we passed a deepfake law this year, and we have in the past as well. We passed a AI deepfake revenge porn law. We did have an algorithmic discrimination law that was proceeding, and that did not pass. And the governor vetoed a bill, speaking of work, around requiring a safety monitor on autonomous trucks. There were some others as well. But there were folks who criticized us for saying, what you're saying with these potential catastrophic harms, it's all theoretical. Some of the opponents would say it's science fiction. Last I checked, shutting down the grid, melting down the banking system, or launching a chemical weapon are not science fiction. These are real things that there are people in the world right now who are working very hard to do. And so the question is if there is a way to make it harder for them to do those things via the model, the technology in the model, why wouldn't we at least consider that?
Florence, we you know, so it feels to me like in the United States, we are very, very good at regulating harms to the body, like actual death, and we're good at regulating loss of money. We do those two things quite well in this country. But this world of deep fakes, being fooled, human agency, these questions are squishy enough by American legal standards that, you know, Senator Wiener mentioned the anti-deepfakes law. A federal judge halted that law, protecting the right to put, you know, satire out in the world. We're not traditionally very open to these sort of squishier questions. Meanwhile, you know, you have countries like India banning self-driving vehicles because huge swaths of that population are private drivers, right? You have these countries in which I feel like something very fundamental is being reflected about either their economics, you know, the way their market works, or something about maybe just the broad psychology of the populace. And I wonder, do you think that we need to invent, or has your survey here of governance options given you the sense that there needs to be something more than just money and death taken into account here? And what models do you look at for that?
It's actually a tough question. I mentioned earlier this notion of systemic risk that is now being used in EU regulations, that was borrowed from the financial sector, because the systemic risk is something that became widely used after the financial crisis in 2008. So now we are using it in Europe to describe all those risks that affect society as a whole. And of course, we have this focus in the EU on fundamental rights. And so it's, of course, very broad. But I think it's, of course, when you want to regulate various types of harm to make sure that people are not discriminated against, that people are not offended online, it's very difficult to achieve all these goals at the same time. So my main critique about this would be to say, well, maybe we should start with the most dangerous applications and deaths and major what Senator Wiener called critical harms, or the most serious dangers and the most serious risks, and then we could try to work on the less serious cases. There is one example that I could have about something that is being taken very seriously in France and Europe at the moment. It's and which is considered here as well, which is how these technologies affect kids and teenagers. I saw last week that there is a new litigation about a teenager that committed suicide after interacting with chatbots that probably led him to commit suicide, but it's as far as I know, the facts of the case are a little unclear. But this kid was clearly addicted to this application. He was interacting with it all day. And so this is something that is being taken very seriously in France and in Europe. You have various initiatives about this to really protect kids and make sure that there is a verification of their age when they connect to the tool. And so if I could focus on one example, and one important example, I think we should probably insist on this one.
Gerard, I'd be curious to know your response to this as well, right? The EU AI regulations specifically call out human agency. It refers right to this principle that they should always retain the ability to make informed decisions while using AI. I think many courtrooms would, many judges would laugh you out of an American courtroom thinking along those lines. Give us your feelings about that.
Well, I think the underlying approach is that tech should serve people and not the other way around. We're not here to serve tech. It's tech should serve people. So we should continue to have oversight. So if there's a decision taken that, like, you shall not get that loan, then there should be an opportunity for a human review so that you have an opportunity to also understand how the decision is taken, because many of these decisions are black boxes. The ones that are running these algorithms don't even understand why the algorithm has come out with that particular decision. But to have like humans in the loop, as we call a human part of it, that seems to be to us to be something that is at the heart of our society. We are not going to be run by technology. We are still kind of, we have still agency. I think one thing I wanted to say something about is on the governance side of things. I mean, it is complicated. AI is complicated. Regulating is always complicated, particularly when kind of you see technology moving forward. So you need a body of expertise. You need kind of people in your system that kind of can advise. And so the European Commission, I work for the European Commission. It sounds a little bit biased here, but the European Commission, and we have the sole right of initiative. So all legislation in the European Union comes out of the European Commission. If we would go home, the Parliament can just shut down, the Council can shut down. There's nothing happening in the European Union. We have the sole right of initiative. We have the European Commission is like a do tank. We are like a think tank, but we can't just think, we have to act, because we have this right of initiative. So there is this idea that somehow the government doesn't understand this because it's too complicated. I come from an organization of 1,000 people in DG Connect, which is the digital, department, digital ministry. There's engineers, there is software developers, there's lawyers, there's like sociologists. There's kind of computer scientists there. We do understand, and we take our time also to understand. We've been studying this very actively. We bring in expert groups, we issue white papers, we issue green papers, we do impact assessment, we do major public consultation. So this legislation is informed. And then the advantage that we have is that we put into the legislation kind of empowerment. So this is not legislation that is set in stone and like you would have to kind of go back to the beginning and make a new proposal to change it. No, we have empowerment, which is called delegated and implementing acts. For example, how do you define these very powerful AI models? And we have defined it slightly differently. Our threshold is slightly below the US executive order threshold, 10 to the 25th. So sometimes we hear you're going to have too many in scope. It's going to be too many. You're going to be blown out of the water as a regulator. Well, if that's the case, we just flip a switch and we move the threshold up if that's needed. So we have this opportunity. I mean, the code of practice, we're asking the industry and the stakeholders to come and help us. Like, well, how do you do red teaming? How do you do alignment? How would you do incident reporting? And all of these things that the AI Act in very broad terms set out. And then you develop a code of practice. And that code of practice will become a presumption of compliance, a presumption of conformity. I mean, the AI Act works on the basis of standards because we have long experience to think that we don't know how to regulate risk. I mean, we have product regulation on risk going back 40, 50 years. We have a huge tradition on regulating risk of products. I mean, if you go to the European Union, you see sometimes on boxes the CE mark on it. That's the new approach, which now is like 50 years old. So we follow that approach. The industry is very familiar with that approach. And therefore, I mean, how to regulate risk? We do it by setting out essential requirements in the law. Something has to be safe. And then there's a standardization body in the European Union, European Standardization Organization, CENELEC, ETSI. They come together with all the stakeholders, industry, but not only industry, and they say, okay, this is what that means. If you want to translate it into a standard, this is how it looks. And then the ones who are under the legislation, they demonstrate compliance by reference to the standard.
Yeah.
And that's the way it works. And it gives you the flexibility to rely, even if the technology moves forward, to have a framework in place that provides the necessary predictability. But it is not easy. I don't think there are many countries in the world, including this one, that has the capacity to implement the EU AI Act, because you need resources for that. You need resources to develop the policy, to implement the policies, and to enforce the policy. We're now recruiting, we're building up an AI office for the powerful generative AI models. There'll be 150 people, which we are recruiting now in under 12 months' time. This is going to cost 40 million euros to run this office. So this is not a given. And then we have the member state and market surveillance authority. So if you're doing this, you need to have the governance structures in place. You need to understand it. You need to have people who help you with kind of understanding it. And then you need to implement it and enforce it. This is not done by a man and a dog in a coffee shop.
Yeah. So we're going to take some questions from the audience here. My microphone is the one that we have to use, so that's going to be awkward. So get your questions ready. Or perhaps we can use names, except hang on to it for a second, because I do want to ask you and Florence together. Well, yeah. So, I mean, I'd be curious to know from anybody, right? This issue of, well, let's go to questions from the audience, because we're going to run out of time, and I could go on and on and on. So let's do that. Let's take, well, thanks, Zeke. Yeah. Zeke's going to be the power broker here. You go ahead. You just hand it out. There you go. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you all so much for being here today to talk to us. Mr. De Graaf mentioned earlier that trust, specifically consumer trust, is essential to the market. And we also know that I think it's well documented that American trust in institutions is at an all-time low. So my question for Senator Wiener and for Ms. Thamkul is, how can institutions like the government or like corporations build trust with consumers such that government regulation or self-regulation becomes more plausible?
Well, I mean, self-regulation is not a thing. I mean, self-regulation is, industry saying, we promise we'll do this, and then some companies will be really meticulous about doing it, and some won't. And query in our situation, what we were asking for is to do the safety testing that all the large labs are all committed to doing. So they were like, we promise we're going to do it. And we're like, okay, let's put it in law. Oh, no. Can't do that. It's not feasible, and a million others. So I'll focus on government regulation. I think that one of the problems, if you think about it, like food safety, for example, right? Like people just may not even realize what the government is doing to make sure that, those E. coli outbreaks that are really minimized, and how horrible it would be if we didn't have food safety standards, right? That you don't have to, or all sorts of other things where like you can just take for granted someone is looking out for this. So the FAA is making sure that the planes are being, maintained properly, right? And you don't even have to think much about that. And I think a lot of times, however, people, because there's one particular political party that for 50 years is saying government can't do anything right, everything about government is bad, people then lose sight of that. They don't think anymore about how there's a government that paves the roads and does all these other things. And the best image that encapsulates this is in 2010 when the Affordable Care Act was being debated. The very famous sign that some right-wing activist was holding, saying, "Government, get your hands off my Medicare." Remember that one? Where people don't even realize it's the government. And so we sometimes have to be better about reminding people that what some of these public health and safety things that the government does that actually truly make people's lives safer and healthier. And that's how you rebuild trust. Government has done a very poor job letting people know.
Yeah, Janel, what's your
From an industry perspective, I think when in the phase where you're still trying to understand what the risks are in order to understand what the rules should be, the best thing you can do is provide transparency around your processes and what you're doing to try to identify the risks and also mitigate them. So one thing we've done at Anthropic is we've published our responsible scaling policy, which puts in place, well, basically categorizes different models according to AI safety levels. So, that maps to the propensity of a model to potentially create harm or create risks. And then for each level, we've laid out rules that we've laid out for ourselves on what we'll do before we'll train or deploy the next level model in terms of next safety level model, so that the general public, policymakers, regulators can see, what the commitments are and how we're thinking about risk and risk mitigation. And in that way, providing the transparency, being open about what we're doing, and also creating an environment of feedback is how we're going to continue to iterate and get to the rules that should be in place.
Can I just say one thing on regulation, which is that the idea that there will be no regulation of this new technology is ridiculous. There's like there will be regulation. The question is who's going to be doing the regulation. And so take something like the copyright issues or defamation from the models, that there is going to be regulation. It might be done by courts, right? Or we might be ceding the ground to the EU or other countries. And so there is going to be regulation. And even existing laws, right, are going to be sort of applied to deal with liabilities and risks that are created by this new technology. And the question is whether we update our thinking on this. Now, I do think that the uncertainties related to this new technology put us in the United States in a particular bind that you don't have in Europe for the reasons that Gerard said, which is that the kind of iterative, dialogic kind of relationship with the companies is something that is particularly difficult in the United States for various reasons, and also because of constitutional constraints that have been put on executive agencies in the U.S., where the administrative state is going to become increasingly difficult. And so it is very difficult to do the kind of broad delegations to agencies that happen in the EU, and then have updating of it sequentially over time as new risks emerge. One of the reasons why I've been sort of a big fan of trying to think of whether we can develop third-party auditing regimes akin to what we have in the financial industry to apply to AI, in part so we can spin it up much quicker, so that we don't have to hide, because the enforcement questions in the U.S. generally, or in any of these countries, are some of the most important ones. If we could get essentially an outside auditing regime up and running, it'd be critical in order to validate whether the companies are checking their homework.
As Zeke moves to the next question, I'll just also point out, I just think it's worth noting, right? China is the other model, right? I was once on a panel where there were 3 models on offer, and everyone in the audience was basically a member of a consulate from Indonesia, other Southeast Asian and South Asian countries. They were essentially there shopping for which policies they should be trying to implement around AI. And the people on stage, members of industry, for the most part, did not want to say the word China out loud. It fell to me to say, here is how China does it. And here's the liability policy that they have, in which the CEO could be personally held responsible if you slander Xi Jinping using the AI systems that they build, those sorts of things. So I think worth noting here, right, that's, as I'm sure Florence could tell us all about, is the other huge model that's out there. So go ahead, Steve.
Hi. If we return back to Dario's very excellent manifesto for a moment here, one of the core theses of that document was that AI is likely to kind of supercharge 100 years of technological progress into a very short timeline, say 3 to 5 years. And so my question is, if that were to come to pass, how do we reimagine and retool our overall regulatory apparatus to be able to navigate a world where there's 100 years of progress, both good and bad, compressed into a 3 to 5 year time frame? And note that this is not a question about AI per se. It's about AI powering many aspects of life and society into a compressed time frame. How do we reimagine our regulatory apparatus to be able to cope with that pace?
I think one of our Europeans should answer this one. Yeah. or our elected official. Could be the mic.
Well, I mean, it is going to be hard. It's really hard. I mean, it's always hard, but now because of the compressed time frame, it's even harder. I mean, typically governments aren't used to getting things done in spans of like months. I mean, we're thinking years, and that's not going to change. And so it might, but I mean, I think there will not be pressure. I mean, it depends like what the impacts are going to be. And politicians are human beings, and so they are subjective to like external like pressures that they will come under. And so if there are negative impacts, there will be calls like, well, this has to be stopped, or this has to be kind of steered in another direction. I mean, we have a lot of laws already in place, and so these laws aren't completely like superfluous. I mean, these laws, and particularly those which are, and most of them are based on like principle. We don't have like many really prescriptive laws. I mean, they will be interpreted as much as possible to kind of to deal with situations that the lawmakers could not have foreseen when the law was kind of discussed and adopted and implemented. There might be some situations where the law will need to be changed. Well, we are, I mean, unlike China, where you can change a law like 1 minute to the next. I mean, we're democracies. We're proud democracies. So we will invite our institutions, those democratically elected, to take a view on how these laws need to be changed. Well, that may take a little bit of time. It might kind of create some it might delay some things a little bit. That's the price we pay for being democracies. We take our time to take the decisions on behalf of the people.
Yeah.
And we don't rush. And so I think a lot of it can be dealt with within the framework that we have at the moment. Some of it will require adjustments, and then we'll make those adjustments as speedily as possible. But we won't kind of set aside the democratic institutions. To take our time to get it right.
Senator Wiener, do you take it as an article of faith that AI will empower this sort of rapidly, 100 years of progress in a few years? Do you?
It could. I'm going to get probably my number of years wrong, but I was recently about the printing press. Some of the printing press changed everything. I think it actually took a very, very long time for the printing press it had impacts immediately, but in terms of what we think of as global impacts, it took a long, maybe, I don't know if it's like 100 years or 200 years, where everyone could read and it was like mass produced, and it wasn't like, incredibly expensive books. And so that was, and then if you think about cars, it was faster than that, but it was still, by the time, it took us many, many years to see how cars would impact society in some good ways and in many, many bad ways, like the destruction of the physicality of a lot of cities and so on and so forth. It took a long time. And so it took so long that we didn't really fully predict what the downsides were going to be. And it wouldn't have been nice if we had known well in advance, so that we could have maybe said, hey, no, we're not going to let those things happen. But if this is really going to be compressed into 3 to 5 years, that there are downsides to that in terms of just paralysis and oh man, there's no way we can figure this out. in 3 to 5 years. Another downside is if something really bad happens before people have seen the benefits, there will be a tidal wave public backlash, and a lot of things will get shut down. People will be like, okay, ChatGPT is cool, and we've seen some cool things, but they haven't really seen, curing cancer and creating, new antibiotics and all the things that could happen, but they've just seen something intensely bad. So that's sort of an issue. And so,
in a way, it sounds as if, to the prior questioner's point as well, right? There's this question of, do I understand you correctly, that it would somehow create additional trust if regulation did its job well early in order to facilitate trust that leads to cancer treatments?
Yes, but if we don't have the catastrophe, and if all of a sudden everything rolls out really quickly, that could lead to something beneficial, that people see the impacts quickly, the positive impacts, and we quickly see, okay, now we know all the things that we need to do, and it's not going to take us 50 or 100 years. We're going to be able to do it now. So it just depends on how things roll out and how people perceive it.
Firstly, my hearty congratulations to the author of the book. My question is, from a political science international relations point of view, there are four important points that constitute a state: people, government, sovereignty, and territory. When it comes to AI and Gen AI and its regulation, we also say the best government is that which governs, the maximum. Maybe minimum government and maximum governance. That's what we say. My question here is, I would like to understand from the panel of experts. I come from India. There is no level playing field in the artificial intelligence. The geopolitics of AI is very unfair. It's not in favor of many countries when you see the global geopolitics and AI. So in this scenario, how do we bring in the policymakers, the academics, the technology guy, the media guy together and, hey, say, build a democratic AI enforcement agency? Any thoughts on that? Any thought leadership from this panel of experts on thinking from Asia, Africa, Europe? Let's say Europe is leading the way, but we, certain developing countries, long way to go, because there is a digitally haves, digitally have-nots. And there is so much.
But I also say with that, like, and having been the author of SB 1047, I got to hear and see every possible argument, all the different strains of arguments. And one of the things that we heard from opposition in the tech world, particularly, in various aspects, in various parts of that world, were this is a race with China, and whoever achieves, it was AGI or whatever, the most powerful AI, the first wins. Period. Military dominance, everything dominance. And so we have to win. We have to beat, China, and we have to make sure that the U.S. is dominant, and that's going to decide who basically controls the world. And so you have that kind of, and then you also we can see it with different companies. It's just a race for absolute dominance and crushing everyone else. And so that is not very conducive to sort of democratizing. I think it would be great to democratize it and just have everyone benefit a lot. But it's such powerful technology that both governments and corporations have a mega massive incentive to try to just like keep it to themselves.
Florence, do you have or Janel?
Yeah, from an industry perspective, I think, I personally believe that the public benefit, societal benefit power of this technology is to democratize access to many different things, including access to justice, access to information, access to resources. So it's imperative for us to bring that to nations, countries that might not be the United States or the dominant leaders in developing the technology. One thing that Anthropic has done as a part of its product development, is sourcing what we call Claude's collective constitution. So a little bit of background here. When we develop our model, we train it to abide by a constitution or a set of principles by which we want the model to behave. And certainly our V1 of Claude's constitution was probably more democratically Western country leaning. But as we've continued to do research in this space, we realize how important it is to reflect more than just a Western perspective or more than just a San Francisco Bay Area perspective. And so we've engaged in studies, inviting people from many different backgrounds, from other countries, to contribute to Claude's constitution to see what that results in, and to ensure that this technology not only has to be accessible to other people across the globe, but also resonates for them as well. So those are some just industry attempts to make this technology accessible beyond our local areas.
Janel, can I just follow up on that to ask, the club of companies that can currently afford to create foundational models is very small because the capital investments are so enormous. Is there, do you think, a way to square that with the question who's concerned for a greater sharing of opportunity? And do you think that we are in the market approaching a point where these companies will no longer be quite as dependent on the capital markets and not quite, be able to be a little more freewheeling with the values of their founders, such that they could be a little more equitable in thinking about how it's distributed? Anthropic obviously is trying to lead the way in this, but how do we reconcile those two things?
So developing frontier models is extremely cost intensive. Not going to lie about that. That said, I think that you don't have to be developing frontier models in order to develop technologies that democratize or provide access to information or access to resources across the globe. And so I think what's really interesting is we're seeing interest in adoption of open source models. Smaller models also are as equally effective in terms of the market applications and driving an economic impact from the technology. So I would say, trying to answer the question delicately, but my point being, I don't think it's necessary to be developing the frontier model in order to provide the kind of broader access and public good that the technology can provide.
Can I just say one thing on this, which is that the open model question is, for me, like the regulatory question. Yeah. That it, to some extent, unless you sort of begin with an analysis of that problem, which is whether we are going to live in a world that's oligopolistic and similar to what we saw with social media, or whether we are going to take the risks of having some of these very powerful models being open, and then with the downside possible benefits that folks around the world are going to be able to use it. That's true to lift people up, who might not have access to this, but it's also non-state actors or state actors or people who want to do harm. We need to decide whether we're going to join arms and jump off that cliff, and it's going to be a very challenging regulatory question as to how you structure an industry which doesn't realize those risks, but then can realize the kind of democratic aspirations of AI.
Florence, is there a precedent for this open source question that Daniel Ek and Zuckerberg are arguing for? In my experience, no big tech CEO does anything for one reason. There's obviously a strategy behind almost every move, but in this case, is the argument that they're making, and this, I think the linking arms and jumping off the cliff is a really good analogy. Is there a precedent for this at
all? So yes, currently what's going on in US, at least in Europe, but also everywhere else, is the fact that you have companies like Meta that are pushing on open models, and of course we can discuss the definition of open models, and we can discuss how open Llama is. I think if I could speak about one precedent, it would be, I'm looking at Meta strategy. Sorry about that, but a few years ago, you probably remember when Meta announced its own cryptocurrency, saying we are going to bring the technology to the world. We're going to bring our own cryptocurrency to other countries, other continents like Africa. And so people that lack a real banking system in their own countries, they will access our mobile app and they will be able to make payment online. And so this is something that is clearly, to me, a way to implement the technology all over the world, but not probably the way we want it. So this initiative, of course, this initiative failed. But today, what's going on with these open models is, of course, one major benefit, which is the fact that you can get access to the technology for free and very powerful models. But at the same time, of course, as you said, no one will do anything for free, and no company will do anything for free. What I would like to add to your questions about your question is the fact that this, what you refer to, what is called the global AI divide. And so this global AI divide is currently being discussed in every summit, every international summit on AI. It was discussed in Seoul. It was discussed in the UK last year. It will be discussed in France in a few months. And of course, it's a problem. And I would say you have two different issues there. First, the access to the technology. I'm very interested as a European scholar who has been working on this concept of digital sovereignty that is so popular in Europe, to see that today you have companies like NVIDIA that promotes the concept of sovereign AI. It's recent, but basically the fact that every country should have its own sovereign AI in infrastructure, which is of interest, but I don't know the recipe for this because the resources that you need to develop your own sovereign system are so enormous that I don't know how we can work. But it's the first aspect, the access to the technology and the development of the technology. And the other aspect is the fact that, of course, we all want to share global standards. And so we need to agree on a set of standards. And this is what government regulation cannot achieve. And this is why you have all those initiatives at the G7 level, at the G20 level. You have these AI summits. And the idea is to agree globally on a set of principles that everyone can share. And of course, it's not that easy. You have various focus depending on the country. You mentioned China. There is a whole chapter in the report about China. But when you look deeply at the China framework, you can see that there is an interest, a focus on disinformation. And so it's a certain focus. So I think this is the challenge here, to find and to reach a set of principles that everyone can agree on.
We'll have time, I think, for one more question, but Gerard, go ahead and get it.
Just very quickly, I mean, about like inclusion and making sure that AI is something that benefits the world. I mean, often I think we think like as long as we have like the global south or the developing countries at the table, it's all right. Because then they can discuss, they can bring their views in. I mean, you need the capabilities. I mean, in Africa, there is one supercomputer in Senegal, which has been donated by France. It's the equivalent of a Toyota Corolla. It's not the kind of supercomputer with which you can build your frontier models. So, cloud facilities, very kind of patchy in the developing world. So we need to think about how to enable, of course, the developing world itself so that they can develop their own large language models, not just come and discuss and put like some ideas on the table that like how we should do it. And that's not sufficiently happening. And I think that's where we have an obligation altogether to make sure that kind of we cut the dependency. I think the other thing is on the principles and standards. I mean, AI there's value embedded in AI. This is our fundamental values are in AI. So to think that we can sit around the world with regimes, I mean, you gave, I think, good summary of like the three kind of different approaches to AI, and we will all find like common ground on this. I mean, it's not going to happen, frankly. It's not going to happen because our view of AI and how it should be used in our society is fundamentally different from the Chinese view on AI and how it should be used in their society. It's control, it's surveillance, and so that is just, it's not technical. I mean, this is where standardization institutes are struggling. This is not technical. This is about like in what world do we want to live, and that's also not something we want to outsource to like technical engineers. The last point, and that's from a policymaker's point of view, and we seem to kind of almost accept it as an inevitable outcome, is that we will have a limited number of very, very, very powerful players, and we know them, or we know most of them, who are going to kind of determine like how AI is going to be used in the world. It is not inevitable. This is not how it was like 5 years or 10 years ago. I mean, institutes like Stanford were incredibly like active in this space. So let's think also about how we can avoid, because from a policymaker point of view, there's lots of investigations going on now, also on competition, kind of antitrust types of issues. We want to see like a flourishing kind of landscape of where AI can be developed in India, can be developed in Europe, can be developed in the US, that we're not looking at the same players that we've been looking at for the last 10 or 15 years, and where, frankly, we've lost trust because these players promise to do all kinds of things and they haven't done them. So I think that's the other thing. Let's not get ourselves kind of carried away that it must be like this. It doesn't have to be like this. But then we have to take measures to ensure that we get a different outcome.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and congrats again to Professor G'sell for this very comprehensive and unique report. I have one small remark and one question. The small remark is really to thank Senator Wiener for anchoring what maybe sometimes characterized as a mundane risk as very tangible and important ones. Because at the end of the day, when we speak about generative's impact on the environment, or for example, healthcare, the risk related to healthcare misdiagnosis, this could also be framed as existential risks. So I really appreciate, to be able to emphasize a continuum across both of those different issues. And then my question, which I think you started tackling in the second part of this panel, is really regarding how can we reconcile the need to respect local values with the legality of AI system, meaning how can we have interoperable legal systems while at the same time, respecting like the different regulatory approaches, which I think are a core part also of the report of Florence G'sell, and like seeing what is the European versus, for example, the American approaches to it. Thanks.
Just to sort of follow on this as we sort out among the panel who wants to answer this. I mean, I've heard from technologists over and over again. We just need to somehow build into. I was at a meeting once where there was a group of AI people on one side of the table, a group of academics on the other side of the table, and one of the AI people was presenting the model that he proposed to build, in which we will enter thousands of lines in which it is. It would be inappropriate to blank with my coworker. We'll do that 10,000 times using Mechanical Turk, and at the end we will arrive at universal human values. And then he said, "Does anyone have any questions?" And every academic raised their hand. And the first one said, "I just want to know what is universal, what is human, and what are values." We don't even agree on that. So I don't know how to answer this question, but I'm very curious to hear if anyone on the panel does.
I mean, it's all,
well, I can share the industry perspective, right? For some areas of regulation, you basically lead to compliance towards the most conservative approach, because that's, from an industry perspective, that's the most efficient, and that's how you scale regulatory compliance. And you've kind of seen that happen with the GDPR. US-based tech companies don't have like a California version of their models or their products. Most of the companies have, looked to the GDPR as like the privacy regulatory benchmark. I think there are some areas where that just doesn't work. And that, I see that in the copyright space in particular. The US copyright regime has fair use, which is a very different model from the EUCD opt-out regime. And in conversations with civil society, with industry players, with policymakers, there's a reluctance to, from one perspective, give more or create rights that don't exist, but at the same time try to comply with rights that do exist under a different legal framework. And so I think that's going to be a major tension. I would love Gerard's perspective on that as well. There are some things you can solve for from industry can solve for. There are others where it just looks like kind of at a dead end at the moment.
Well, actually think it's going to be really fascinating to see how this plays out in different countries, because even though the technology will be universal, same technology spreading around the world, we have how well authoritarian regimes try to, you have a lot of governments, not just authoritarian, but governments trying to control the technology, and then technology trying to control or supersede governments. And we've seen with like social media how in democracies it's just sort of run just wild, for better, in good ways, bad ways. We've seen authoritarian regimes try to shut it down or block it. Some, like China, has been more effective at doing that. Others, maybe less so. There's a book called Revolt of the Public. It's a really good book, and there's a whole section about the fall of the Egyptian regime about 15 years ago, which was fueled by social media, and they tried to shut it down and couldn't. But then you had other countries that have been able to. So I think it's totally unpredictable how it's going to interact going forward.
Let us thank our panelists for a very, very interesting time. And congratulations again to Professor G'sell for this extraordinary book. For those of you who I think have pre-registered, might have a chance to take home with one of these. And again, thank you everyone for being here. Really appreciate it.
The reception is
there is
it's